Welcome, everybody. Can you hear me? Maybe this isn't doing much. I don't know. Okay. Welcome, everybody, to this third and final in the series of the Hitchcock Foundation Lectures entitled After the Fact, Indonesia, Morocco, and the Recurrent Anthropologist. And last week we heard from several introducers about a lot of what Clifford Geertz has done over the course of his distinguished career. Most of us have been influenced profoundly by his research, know at least some of his corpus of writing, but I didn't want this opportunity to go by without telling you at least some of the honors that he's received. These are the things that we don't hear about in the course of our normal academic life, because it's a truly lengthy and very impressive list. And I'm only going to choose two categories to give everybody some idea of the kind of scholar that we have in our presence and the recognition that he's received. First, the honorary doctorates that have been conferred upon Clifford Geertz. Harvard University in 1974, Northern Michigan University in 1975, University of Chicago in 1979, Bates College in 1980, Knox College in 1982, Brandeis University in 1984, Swarthmore College in 1984, the New School for Social Research in 1987, and Yale University in 1987. I doubt there is another member of our profession that could even remotely match that record. And then also I just wanted to briefly mention the distinguished lectureships to which Professor Geertz has been named. He was the John Dewey Lecturer at Antioch College, the Lionel Trilling Lecturer at Columbia University, the Storrs Lecturer at Yale University, the Harry F. Camp Memorial Lecturer at Stanford University, the Distinguished Lecturer at the American Anthropological Association in 1983, the Obert C. Tanner Lecturer at the University of Michigan in 1985. So a lot of very well-known and respected places got to Professor Geertz before we did, but I'm glad we finally got around to inviting him and pleased to bring him to you once again. He's going to speak to us today on a topic he knows something about. He's had a few things to say about it: cultures. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Thank you, Professor Brandeis, for establishing my authority. The conclusion you should draw, obviously, is that if you don't agree with me, you're wrong. But we'll come for that. Once upon a time, not so very long ago, when the West was a good deal more sure of itself, of what it was and what it wasn't, the concept of culture had a firm design and a definite edge. At first, global and evolutionary, it simply marked the West, rational, historic, progressive, devotional, off from the non-West, superstitious, static, archaic, magical. Later, when for a host of reasons, ethical, political, and wistfully scientific, this seemed too crude and too candid, the need for an exacter, more celebratory representation of the world elsewhere came into being, and the concept shifted to the lifeway of a people form familiar to us now. Islands, tribes, communities, nations, civilizations, eventually classes, regions, ethnic groups, minorities, youth, in South Africa, even races, in India, even sects, had cultures, manners of doing things, distinct and characteristic, one apiece. Like most powerful ideas in the human sciences, this notion came under attack virtually as soon as it was articulated. The clearer the articulation, the more intense the attack. Questions rain down, and they continue to rain down, on the very idea of a cultural scheme. Questions about the coherence of lifeways, the degree to which they form connected wholes. Questions about their homogeneity, the degree to which everyone in a tribe, a community, or even a family, to say nothing of a nation or a civilization, shares similar beliefs, practices, habits, feelings. Questions about discreteness, the possibility of specifying where one culture, say the Hispanic, leaves off and the next, say the Amerindian, begins. About continuity and change, objectivity and proof, determinism and relativism, uniqueness and generalization, description and explanation, consensus and conflict, otherness and commensurability. And about the sheer possibility of anyone, insider or outsider, grasping so grand and complicated a thing as an entire way of life and finding the words to describe it. Anthropology, or anyway the sort that studies cultures, proceeds amid charges of irrelevance, bias, illusion, and impracticability. But it proceeds. No matter how much one trains one's attention on the supposedly hard facts of social existence, who owns the means of production, who has the guns, the dossier, or the newspapers, the supposedly soft facts of that existence, what do people imagine human life to be all about? How do they think one ought to live? What grounds belief, legitimizes punishment, sustains hope, or accounts for loss? Crowd in to disturb simple pictures of might, desire, calculation, and interest. Everyone, everywhere, and at all times seems to live in a sense-suffused world, to be the product of what an Indonesian scholar has nicely called a history of notion formation. Bent on certitude, Olympianism, or codifiable method, or simply anxious to pursue a cause, one can ignore such facts, obscure them, or pronounce them forceless. But they do not thereby go away. Whatever the infirmities of the concept of culture, cultures, cultural forms, there is nothing for it but to persist in spite of them. Tone deafness, willed or congenital, and however belligerent, will not do. When I began my work in the early 50s, they have a culture out there and it's your job to come back and tell us what it is conception of the anthropological enterprise was only beginning to be questioned, and then largely from outside the field. By the time I moved on to North Africa, about a decade later, doubts had grown somewhat stronger and a good deal more interior, but nothing really drastic had happened to the general mindset of the field. Our paradigms for both research and writing were still various sorts of classic, quote, people studies, the Navajo, the Nuer, the Trobriandas, the Ifugao, the Todas, the Talensi, the Kwakiutl, the Tikapia, with a few community studies, Tepoztlan, Suyamura, a bit later on, Alcalá de la Sierra, beginning to appear in complex societies, Mexico, Japan, Spain. Faced, as I was with Java, upon which just about every would-be world civilization has had a transformational impact, Cynic, Indic, Mid-Eastern, Romance European, Germanic European, and with Morocco, Berber and Arab, African and Mediterranean, factious, tribal, and walled-in urban, the sense of having gone to sea in a skiff was reasonably immediate. It did not, in any case, take very long to become aware that they indeed do things differently elsewhere and think about them otherwise, differently from the United States, otherwise than oneself, differently and otherwise from one another, and that a conception of culture as a massive causal force shaping belief and behavior to an abstractable pattern, what has been called the cookie-cutter view, is not very useful either for investigating such matters or for conveying what one claims to have come up with from having investigated them. We need something a good deal less muscular, a good deal more reactive, quizzical, watchful, better attuned to hints, uncertainties, contingencies, and incompletions. Should help. To make all this somewhat less programmatic, let me just give one example, as an example, compressed and illustrative, and preliminary to what I'm going to have Jenry to say, of such reactive, what is going on here, sort of cultural analysis in my own case. The first thing one does when setting out to study a country such as Indonesia or Morocco, or a town therein, aside from reading various books variously useful, is to begin to learn the language. That in itself, before one gets anywhere near systems of land tenure, rules of marriage, or ritual symbolism, suggests enough conjectures, however offhand, to project one imaginatively, however off-balanced, into the middle of things. One doesn't exactly penetrate another culture, as the masculinist image would have it. You put yourself in its way, and it bodies forth and enmeshes you. I began studying Indonesian about a year before going to the field. It was a group oral effort, conversational, together with my colleagues, which was directed by a Malayo-Polynesian linguist sent up from Yale, and, quote, informed by a native speaker studying, as I remembered, psychology at Harvard. Indonesian, a variety of Malay, is the national language of the country, but what was spoken in Pare, and for the most part still is, was Javanese, a related but, say, French and Italian, different language. So after having arrived in the country, my wife and I spent another 6 months studying that language in the old Javanese court town of Yogyakarta. We hired local college students to come to our hotel room one after the other, relay style, through the day. We wore them out as instructors and adapted Indonesian lesson plans the linguist had prepared. That is, we had our instructors translate the Javanese into Javanese, the Indonesian sentences that had previously been translated to English, and then speak them back to us. As for Arabic, I began my engagement with it, not to use a stronger word, by taking a formal course in classical, that is modern standard, while I was teaching in Chicago, supplementing that again with, oral work with a Moroccan graduate student studying in the business school from Fez on colloquial Moroccan, the language actually spoken, some Berber aside, and Safru. The old Harvard sentences got translated once again into bravura structures they had never dreamed of and worked very well. Later, my wife and I spent 6 months in Rabat using local college students in a dawn-to-dusk relay style as we had in Yogyakarta. And when we returned to Chicago, we found yet another Moroccan graduate student, this one a statistics student who's now actually head of the National Bureau of Statistics in Morocco, to work with us. What is so often represented in anthropological texts, when it is represented at all, as an academical enterprise, a bit like getting on top of algebra or swatting up the history of the Roman Empire, was in fact a multi-sided, multi-language, Dutch and French, the colonial languages were involved as well, social interaction, involving in the end, for the process continued after we arrived at our sites, where our initial encounters took the form we supposed readily comprehensible, believable, and thus unthreatening of language lessons, involving in the end literally dozens of people. Now, a great many things that had nothing very directly to do with such properly linguistic processes as Javanese deixis or Arabic morphology, both of which are more than a little astonishing, were first brought toward the edge of awareness during the course of all this exchanging of multiply reworked, prefabricated sentences. But here I want to mention and connect together in an oblique and somewhat paradoxical way merely two: the stress on status marking in Javanese and that on gender marking in Arabic. Or more exactly, by Javanese and by Moroccans. For whatever it was that Worf was trying to say, it is not the forms of language that generate meaning, but as Wittgenstein did say, the use of such forms to think about something. In this case, who gets deference, and what is the significance of sexual difference? One, of course, assumes that with any people, status discrimination and gender definition are going to be matters of some concern. What is of interest and what varies is the nature of the concern, the form it takes, and the depth of its intensity. That in the cases at hand, we are facing not only a sharp difference in this regard, but something near to a direct inversion, first came home to me when in studying Javanese, my instructors insistently and meticulously corrected any errors I made, lots of them, there are lots of them to make, in status marking, while letting gender errors more or less go. While my Moroccan instructors, like the Javanese as university students, hardly traditionalists, never let a gender mistake, also lots of them and abundant opportunities to make them, pass uncorrected, and seemed hardly interested in status marking, such of it as there was, at all. It didn't seem to matter, or matter very much, whether you got sex right in Javanese, most of the time actually it was lexically neutralized, so long as you kept rank straight. In Morocco, getting genders crossed seemed almost dangerous. Certainly it made my teachers, all of them men, as indeed were the Javanese, very nervous, but rank hardly came into consideration at all. The languages as such support these disparate tendencies to notice some things about the world rather than others and make more fuss about them. Javanese has no inflections for gender, but is grammatically stratified into minutely graded hierarchical speech registers. Moroccan Arabic has gender inflections for just about every part of speech and no status forms at all. Almost not all. But that is too complex and too technical to go into here. What is important here in this classroom demonstration of what cultural analysis, according to me anyway, is and isn't, and how one finds oneself almost reflexively doing it, is what sort of conclusions about Moroccan and Javanese ways of being in the world these contrasting experiences, and they're very contrasting, lead on to. What more substantial matters move into view? It is not, in any case, the mere and simple fact that the Javanese are preoccupied, as they are, with the giving and withholding of gestures of respect, and Moroccans have constructed, as they have, an ontological wall between the male and female halves of their population. The passing traveler without the languages and hardly more than guidebook knowledge will notice the head lowerings and the softened voices, the eye-slit veils and the concealed wives. And the inegalitarian aspects of Southeast Asian life, like the sexist ones of the Mediterranean, have been noted by just about every writer who has attempted to describe them, sometimes to the virtual exclusion of anything else. Indeed, the tendency of such readily visible matters to encourage stereotyping, as well as a certain sort of easy moralizing, is one of the things that has brought the concept of culture, or again more precisely the anthropological use of it, to talk about peoples, the megalomaniac Kwakiyutal, the stalwart Nuer, the disciplined Japanese, the family prison Southern Italians, into question. What puzzles and sets one to meditating about Javanese insistence on the errorless use of status markers and the Moroccan of gender ones, that is, aside from the surprise of the dusty corners teaching language to a casually encountered foreigner, into which the general presumptions of a people reach, some aspects of culture apparently really are everywhere. What comes is not so much their obvious contrast, but again, their anthropologically generated conjunction. Because it was me, after all, not my instructors, who happily corrected me to a single truth, upon whom the contrast fell. And considering the cases together, interpreting them in terms of one another, as reciprocal commentary, independent differences rhetorically, by me, connected, virtually forces you to wonder about the presence of the absent term. If the Javanese are not, as one very soon learns they are not, insouciant about sexual difference, the colloquial terms of address for small children are penis and vagina, and Moroccans are not, as is even more readily evident, calmly oblivious of standing and reputation, the obsequiousness of petitioners is a crafted art, then the thought arises almost of itself that in the one place sexual difference gets expressed and understood as a domestic variety of status, and in the other prestige inequalities get assimilated to the invidious imagery of sex. Once you begin to look at or listen to things this way, you find, like a physicist with a new particle or a philologist with a new etymology, evidence or counter-evidence everywhere. Culture gets polyphonic, even disharmonic. Themes invoking counter-themes, which re-invoke themes, instructively offset from the originals. The fact that, traditionally at least, and in many families still, Javanese husbands speak to their wives in a status-lowering register, and wives to their husbands in a status-raising one. That incest is regarded more as a status error, an inappropriate mixing of levels, and an emotional crime, a confusion of intimacies. That genealogies begin with androgynous gods and descend via duplicating identical twins to humans through marriages of unidentical twins, then siblings, then first and second cousins. All lead, as do a host of other things, from the composition of village councils to the picturing of shadow play figures, into a world where sexual identity exists as an inflection of social hierarchy. The fact that Moroccan Muslims, at least traditionally and in many places still, regard Moroccan Jews as women. In pre-protector times they could not carry guns. And often other foreigners, Tunisians, Egyptians, visiting anthropologists sent off to sit with the ladies as well. Quote, "Those Egyptians can't win," one of my informants said as the Six-Day War approached. "If they lose to the Jews, everyone will say they were defeated by women. If they defeat them, everyone will say all they did was beat a bunch of women." That the monarchy is drenched in masculine symbology, that the discourse of both commerce and politics has a persistent edge of seduction and resistance, flirtation and conquest, all lead one, as do a number of other things, from the understanding of sainthood to the metaphorics of insult, into a world where rank and station are sexually charged. But even this reverse dominant and subdominant representation will not do. For what one discovers when one looks at Java with Morocco as optic, and the other way around, is that what one is faced with is not a collection of abstractable, easily statable themes, sex, status, boldness, modesty, differently tied into local bundles, the same notes set into different melodies, but with complex contradictory fields of significant action, most of it tacit, implicit, across which assertion and denial, celebration and complaint, authority and resistance continuously move. Fields which can, when ingeniously juxtaposed, shed a certain amount of light on one another, but which are neither variants of one another nor expressions of some superfield that transcends them both. And this is the case for everything: Moroccan refractoriness, Javanese effacement, Javanese formality, Moroccan pragmatism, Moroccan brusqueness, Javanese loquacity, Javanese patience, Moroccan haste, to list some other beckoning cliches, getting myself into things fairly quickly produced and of course have to be then deconstructed, with which you find yourself faced as you try to make out what the people you are thrown together with are on about. One is comparing incomparables, a useful enterprise, and when the stars are right, an informative one, however illogical. Now, all this aside and the example concluded, it is of course quite definitely not the case, though the contrary is sometimes pretended, that an adequate account of the workings of culture in such world historical places as these can be constructed on the basis of personal interactions and immediate observations, listening, looking, visiting, and attending. Both countries and both towns within those countries are ingredient in forms of life geographically very much wider and, as I tried to show last time, historically very much deeper than that they themselves directly display. One cannot talk sensibly about Moroccan or Middle Atlas or Sefrewi culture, or about that of Indonesia or Java or Pare, without in the first case invoking such elusive, difficult to bound, and impossible to encapsulate mega-entities as, all these in very heavy quotes, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, Africa, Arabs, France, and Islam, or in the second, again with heavy quotes, Oceania, Asia, Hindu-Buddhism, Malays, the Dutch, and again, but with a somewhat different spin, Islam. Without such ground, there is no figure, and what you see before you has hardly more meaning than a fire in the distance or a shout in the street. Yet how to manage this relation between the large and the little, scene-framing background matters which seem momentous, general, and historically fixed, and local going-ons which do not seem so, is far from clear. It has, in fact, proven increasingly troublesome to anthropologists since, mainly after the Second World War, they began to move away from tribal microcosms, or imagined such, toward societies with cities, creeds, machines, and documents. There has been much hesitation and more than a little evasion. Focus pictures have been hard to come by, and when come by, crude and schematic. That Indonesia and Morocco are, and for centuries have been, about 16 in the one case, about 12 in the other, geographically peripheral members of two different, continuously interacting, occasionally interfusing world civilizations, that which begins roughly at the Indus and ends even more roughly at the Moluccas and New Guinea, and that which, mapping things the other way, begins more or less at the Oxus and ends conventionally in the Western Sahara, is a primary fact about them. Their location at the outer edges of enormous cultural continents whose heartlands are elsewhere is something of which their peoples, however caught up in parochial concerns and however suspicious of outside influences, have been continuously aware. They have always been outliers: farthest India, the most distant West, which are the names for them in the local languages. And they have always had the cultural devices: Hindu legends and Arabian poetics, Buddhist monuments and Persian gardens, Dutch furniture and French cafes, to prevent them from forgetting it. The history of notion formation thus lives in the present, and culture, as it manifests itself in this bazaar or that funeral, this sermon or that shadow play, in ideological division and political violence, city form and population movement, and in language learning, carries with it everywhere the marks of that fact. Understanding a form of life, or anyway some aspects of it to some degree, and convincing others that you have indeed done so, involves more than the assembly of telling particulars or the imposition of general narratives. It involves bringing figure and ground, the passing occasion and the long story, into coincident view. The recognition that there is culturally much in Indonesia and Pare, Morocco and Sefru that was not made in those places, that not only has not only its origins but its canonical setting somewhere else, is quickly come by. Views about how the rich ought to behave and the poor to be treated, about how the world came to be, how truth can be sorted, if it can be, from error, and what happens to people after they die, and about what counts as attractive or repellent, impressive or tawdry, what moves or amuses or leaves one cold, are, unlike countries and unlike towns, difficult to localize in a more than diffuse and unbordered way. But perhaps the most immediate of such reminders, especially again to someone trying to look in two places at once, is the cast of characters. Not the individuals, though they are striking enough, but the dramatis personae that appear suitably named, coiffed, and costumed, and even it sometimes seems with a good deal of their dialogue already scripted, before you. People as people are doubtless much the same everywhere. That is what you commit yourself to in calling them people, rather than Egyptians, Buddhists, or speakers of Turkish. But the parts they play, the parts available for them to play, are not. There are no Falas in Indonesia, though there are certainly people who work the land. They are called Tanis, and suffer the afflictions, though not altogether the same afflictions, that go along with doing so. There are no gurus in Morocco, though there are certainly people who present themselves to their fellows as spiritual exemplars. They are called Sayyids or Marabous, and experience the quandaries, not precisely the same quandaries, that then arise. Even such personae, Hajj, for example, or Sultan, nowadays newspaper columnist, leftist, financier, or media personality, as appear in both places, come somehow to something somewhat different. Classic characters on unclassical stages. The matter is made even harder for a now and then visitor trying to follow the proceedings that, enacted by such characters, unfold on such stages, by the fact that what is center and what edge depends not only on what it is that looks, but on what it is that is looked toward. And what it is that is looked toward is wildly various. Sefru looks toward Fez. Fez looks toward the citied Morocco, Rabat, Casablanca, Marrakesh, and the rest. Citied Morocco looks eastward toward Cairo, Damascus, Tehran, and the rest, and northward toward Madrid, Paris, and more than a bit ambivalently, pan-Mediterraneanized Marseille. Pare looks toward the high art and court regions of central Java, the court regions toward Jakarta, where Indonesia is supposed to be summarized, but perhaps is manufactured, Jakarta toward southern Asia and northern Europe, and all, of course, look toward the great centers of power in the modern world, Washington, Tokyo, Moscow, and New York. These cultural outliers have had, for the foreseeable future will continue to have, an enormous lot from which to be outlined. Both Moroccans and Indonesians, as such, and Arabists, Indologists, Islamicists, Orientalists, and ethnographers, many of them themselves by now Moroccans or Indonesians, have been more than a little at odds concerning what to make of the situation. How to view not only the involvement with faiths, sciences, arts, laws, and moralities concocted elsewhere, but the tangled multiplicity of such involvements. Aside from the mere assertion that some primordial substratum, Afro-Berber or Malayo-Polynesian, has been so strong as to render importations incidental, foreign ornament easily stripped away to reveal the indigenous authenticity concealed beneath, an argument in any case fairly thoroughly discredited by colonial uses of it to undercut resident elites, Arabs against Berber in Morocco, the court is against villages in Indonesia as themselves unnative. Aside from that, which really won't do, the main responses have been either to accept the fact of multiplicity and try somehow to give it a local look, or to minimize it and privilege one or another part of it as the heart of the matter, or of course, and most often, both at once. There are a large number of examples one could take to spell this incertitude succinctly out. But surely the best, at least right now, when everyone seems to have a view about it, usually confident, and it has reemerged as one of the declamatory categories of universal history, is, whatever it is, Islam. Not only has the rise in Muslim self-consciousness, self-assertion, and self-dividedness pushed religious issues and religious personae more toward the center of things in both countries, but scholarly attention, once confined to a few specialists, experts on law, right, or the evolution of brotherhoods, has, since Khomeini, Gaddafi, and the murder of Sadat, and the destruction of Lebanon, virtually exploded. Indeed, It may, so far as Indonesia and Morocco are concerned, have grown more rapidly than the phenomenon in itself. Whether or not either or both of these countries are becoming more thoroughly engulfed by the energies of Islam, a matter concerning which I, at least, am of several minds, the students of their cultures, foreign and indigenous, Muslim and non, most certainly are. But a few years ago, neglected as relic traditions worn down by modernity, the Quran, the Sharia, the ayads, and Sufism now are invoked to explain just about everything. Of the two cases, the Indonesian, and again most especially the Javanese, would appear at first glance to be the more complex. Islam came to the archipelago gradually, segmentally, and more or less peaceably via Persia, Gujarat, and the Malabar coast from about the 14th century, after more or less a millennium of Hindu-Buddhist and Hindu-Buddhist presence, a presence itself installed in what was apparently a diverse collection of long-in-place Malaysian societies, themselves anything but simple. Sorting out its place, that is Islam's place and significance, in the texture of Indonesia's culture has been, as a result, a delicate matter, very much contested. And contested again, both by scholars and by those the scholars were and are ostensibly studying. The two lines of discourse, that of those professionally dedicated to separating things out on the way to reconnecting them in some other way, and that of those existentially obligated to living their way through them, separated or unseparated, have in fact tended and increasingly to mirror one another, even to grow into one another, common understandings of common times. During the colonial period, and especially the closing phases of it, when the rise of pan-Islamism, reformism, and Muslim mass organizations persuaded the Dutch that they needed to have a less bookish than a behavioral knowledge of Islam, Islam always in quotes, the general view, though not of course the universal one, was that the Islamic impact on the archipelago, and particularly on Java, was a surface matter. The creed of the Prophet, it was said, of which most Javanese, it was also said, had anyway but a dim and primitive comprehension, lay upon the island and its thoroughly Indocized culture, quote, like a veil. It was a, quote, religion to which there was indeed some commitment, occasionally strong, but it had, in this view, not penetrated very deeply into the substance of society, which remained pliant, indulgent, diffuse, and syncretic, ungiven to dogma, averse to conflict. A de facto God and Caesar separationism settled into place, not only as one would expect on the Dutch side, but with few exceptions defined as fanatic and nervously distanced on the Javanese as well. The forms of Muslim learning and worship were set aside as, quote, spiritual, thus, quote, personal, private, inward, and unworldly, and their pursuit, at least more or less protected, left more or less to themselves. But collective actions in the name of Islam, being, quote, secular, thus, quote, political, public, external, and worldly, were not, and carefully overseen, prudently self-restrained, were limited to moral and charitable, quote, social matters. Now, with the rise of nationalism, all this changed. Fanatics became militants, separationist collaborators. And with its triumph, the point at which I, unencumbered with either faith or memory, happened upon the scene, it disappeared entirely. The spiritual and the political came with emphasis back together, and, quote, Islam, noisy and organized, became a force among forces struggling to define the soul of the new society. By 1952, when I got to power, Islamicist and Indocist, populist and elitist, traditionalist and secularist conceptions of what sort of country liberated Indonesia ought to be, what sort of culture it ought to have, had hardened into causes, fixed, distinct, jealous, and determined. Islam at this period appeared less a stance than a movement, or more exactly, for their internal divisions not insignificant, a collection of movements, more thoroughly based in some sectors of the society, mainly commercial, and some parts of the country, mainly coastal, than in others, and bent on securing its ascendancy over competing movements, otherwise animated and elsewhere based. A pluralistic, conflictual view representing Islam neither as a veil nor bedrock, but as a particular persuasion thrown in among others, hardly less absolute, thus seemed, both to myself, looking on with rising trepidation, and so far as I could see to the even more uneasy dramatis personae, gurus and alamas, office clerks and party secretaries, implacable youth and women activists, to whom I was talking, exact, and veridical. I wanted to call the book I wrote about all this Religions in Java, but the publisher, a believer apparently in ethnographical kinds, natural labels, and programmed audiences, wouldn't have it, and it emerged suitably normalized and against its argument as the religion of Java. In any case, as I said in the first lecture, 5 years later, events completed it. With the upheavals of 1965 and the soldiers' peace that followed upon them, the conception of the place of, quote, Islam in Indonesian culture, and most critically in Javanese, began again to shift somewhat. No longer able to be a collection of spiritually driven political movements, such movements being forbidden in the wake of the killings and popularly discredited in the wake of those killings, the Muslim interest became once more a set of stances. Only now these stances were increasingly represented, first by those who took them, later on by those observing those who took them, as neither surface nor sectarian, but foundational, inclusive, deep inwrought. The religion indeed of Java, and thus a fortiori of Indonesia. What has come to be known as indigenization has set in. By indigenization, the Indonesian word is indigenizasi, not precisely an indigenous term, is meant an attempt to deal with a problem posed to Quranic orthodoxy by plurality of belief and diversity of practice, and by the unwillingness of the new orders, Suharto State, to tolerate religious purism in any form, by defining all save that clearly unassimilable, because explicitly Christian, pagan, Indic, cynic, or whatever, or unbelieving, as, quote, Islamic. Most especially, it seeks to reduce the tension between the more observant and devotional and the more eclectic and experientialist elements of the population by redrawing the boundaries between what is and what is not admissibly Muslim, redefining what counts as observance, qualifies as devotion. The reification of that most capacious, pliable, manifold, and ill-defined of Muslim categories, Sufism, into a creed-for-all context dogmatical system, and the finding of it everywhere, high, low, past and present, liturgical and literary, has played an important part in this move toward religious lenience and the broad mosque. So too has a rereading of traditional Javanese texts as locally encoded Muslim commentaries, the officialization of Islamic education, Islamic leadership, and even to some degree Islamic observance, and scholarly characterizations of Javanese kingdoms as, quote, Sufi theocracies, Javanese palaces as, quote, analogues of Mecca. Not orthodoxical veils over syncretical bases, not sectarian factions battling with rivals, rather vernacular universalism. Spiritual singleness, what Muslims call tawhid, shining forth in a vast exuberance of homegrown forms. This is not to say that indigenism is unchallenged, either as a program or interpretation, any more than pluralism or separation were and are. Reformists, traditionalists, secularists, syncretists, and that peculiarly Javanese persona, ahli kebatinan, perhaps least badly translated as metasubjectivist, all remain convinced and insistent. And both Iranian shockwaves and the state's imposition on the whole of the country of a Javanese civil religion have complicated the picture more than a little. Nor is one obliged to conclude that there are no grounds for preferring one sort of account of the place of Islam in Indonesian or Javanese culture to another, just because there are several on offer. Perhaps because I was involved in constructing it, but not only because I was involved in constructing it, I think the pluralist field of differences view has force not only for the 1950s, but for the 1920s and 1980s as well, and perhaps even more, and will perhaps have even more for the 90s, as the contradictions of free market authoritarianism begin to set in, that neither Islam as overlay nor Islam as immanence will in the end really do. But that's as may be. The story, far from approaching its end and resolution, what after all is 600 years, has but just begun. The history of notion formation in this aspect of culture, as in any other, and the story of Islam actually stands rather well as patched sample for general weave, is an obscure and unsettled process. Sorting out the domestic from the imported, the bred in the bone from the lightly held, the dying out from the coming on, is a continuous business, carried on without much in the way of codifiable rule or systematized plan. It is only concluded when, at a loss for the moment as to what to say next, you turn equally improvisationally to another patch out of another weave. The resolution I have taken to this point privately, not to describe either of my cases as a reduced version of the other, the bane of a great deal of comparative analysis in the human sciences, Spain lacked Holland's Calvinism, China Japan's feudality, becomes peculiarly hard to sustain when you look, as I of course did, at Islam in North Africa immediately after looking at it in Southeast Asia. Things that seem, quote, missing, absent terms truly absent, fairly leap out at you. In the first place, nothing comparable to 1,000 years of Indic civilization faced the bearers of Islam when they arrived on the plains of what is now central Morocco toward the end of the 8th century. There were some Berber chiefdoms scattered around in the hills and some passage ports along the coasts, but the Roman presence, never that strong this far west, had, like the Phoenician that preceded it, long since disappeared, leaving behind little but a few mosaics, a handful of place names, and apparently no less relics some unusual Christians. Nor did anything much happen culturally to these Arabian adventurers, most were either marauders or refugees. As no Persia or India to spiritualize them in between, they made their way in the space of months to the southern shores of the Mediterranean. In the second place, and in part as a result, there is nothing here, now or in the knowable past, comparable to the Indonesian melange of ethno-spiritual groupings formed around religious or quasi-religious ideologies. Nor Jews, never much more than an encapsulated percent or two of the population in part aside, are there significant numbers of indigenous non-Muslims, as there are, of course, in Indonesia. Nor is there much in the way of ethnic or regional unevenness of Islamization, some but not much, of concern to what is properly Islamic or what merely Arab, or of anxiety about the orthodoxy of local practice. There's a little of that, but not as much has been represented. And perhaps most important, there is no mismatch between community of citizenship and that of faith. National identity and religious affinity seem sides of a coin. There is no need here for a thinned, officialized civil religion to convince people that their broadest political loyalties and their deepest spiritual ones are reconcilable. But this is indeed beginning to sound a little like Henry James's no Epsom nor Ascot, no cathedrals nor abbeys view of Hawthorne's America. What is critical about Moroccan Islam is not that it doesn't much take, and hardly ever has much taken, the sort of associational thought streams form that Indonesia so often has. What is critical is the radically individuating men in their roles form, women again are divided out, dispatched to reticence and household piety, that virtually wherever you look, whenever you look, and where, it does take. Positively characterized, Islam in Morocco is sustained by personages, by a vast and constant crowd of severely independent, grand and middling and petty, religious notables, scholars and judges, descendants of the Prophet and popular charismatics, brotherhood chiefs and Meccan pilgrims, prayer leaders and Quranic lesson givers, mosque officiants, man administrators, and court notaries, law expounders, sermon givers, and supervisors of bazaar ethics. Alims, qadis, sharifs, marabouts, sheikhs, hajis, imams, faqirs, talabs, nadirs, adils, muftis, khatibs, muhtasibs. Like the society generally, an irregular network of irregular figures, constantly adjusting their plans and their allegiances. In seeking some order in this day-to-day, place-to-place, era-to-era play of personalities, some more emphatic, some less, but all concerned to make whatever they can out of whatever their religious positioning sets before them, scholars, and again, if less self-consciously, the personalities themselves, have tried to isolate some cultural fault lines, urban versus rural, learned versus popular, hereditarian versus charismatic, most of them at least as old as Ibn Khaldun, with respect to which such matters might be ad hoc and somewhat sorted out. Faced at any particular point, and any particular location with a particular constellation of familiar types, neither arranged into hierarchical structures, nor sorted into ideological camps, no clerical establishment, no famille d'esprit, What seems to be called for is seeing how the Islam of Islamic personages enters into the general scuffle of social life. This general scuffle is, as I described it last time, a matter of the piling up and breaking down of shifting systems of alliance out of handshake loyalties. In itself, a radically secular, pragmatical, dry-eyed matter, uninfected with transcendental concerns. What, as participants in that process, religious figures add to it, or more exactly, embed within it, is a strenuous, insistent, even aggressive moral tenor, the color of principle beyond the strategic. Nothing of much importance goes on, insofar as I can see, ever has, in this in many ways so worldly society, free of the pressures of Muslim conviction, simply because nothing of much importance goes on, or ever has, free of the involvement of the alims, sheikhs, sharifs, marabouts, and the like, whose vocation is to see to it that those pressures, as they severally conceive them, are not relaxed. This moralization of social struggle by the presence within it of religious personalities possessed of one or another notion of what it is for a country, a community, an individual, or a state to be truly mu'min, that is faithful, believing, upright, honorable, is observable at all sorts of junctures and in all sorts of situations. The configuration of views concerning what it is that makes someone genuinely Muslim certainly changes and will continue to do so. The propagation of those views by the deeds and dealings of energized men struggling for place looks like clientelism to be rather more abiding. In the, so it looks to us now, transitional 16th century, when Morocco began to take its modern shape, the competition among diverse and antagonistic religious figures is so prominent as to seem to drive the whole society. The emergence of rural ecstatics as social prophets, the multiplication and intensified combat, especially in the cities, among brotherhood sheikhs, Sufi sheikhs, the reassertion of descent from Muhammad as the founding principle of monarchic authority, so-called Sharifian monarchy, the appearance literally out of nowhere of men calling themselves Mahdi or Imam, that is, divinely inspired restorers and rectifiers, messiahs, Muslim style, and the reactive insistence against all of this by scholars and legists, the friends of the Sharia, of the supremacy of textual orthodoxy, fashioned the moral landscape, a scattered structure of determined opinion within which the Morocco of the Alawis, of the Protectorate, and of the present developed. As in the Indonesian case, and for similar reasons, the fall of the Shah and the rise of militancy, there is just now a good deal of scholarly re-examination, both domestic and foreign, of this whole process. Received ideas, the importance of Christian intrusion into the development of Moroccan nationalism, the political discontinuity between settled plains subservient to the government and tribal mountains resistant to it, the quasi-caliphal role of the king, the quietist reactionary role of the brotherhoods, all these things, so long received, are subject again to fierce debate, as is the weight overall of Muslim belief in Moroccan history. But whatever the outcome of the debates, which are tending to take a sort of indigenous direction, or the assessment of the force of Islam, no one now thinks it surface or secondary or about to go away, the religion of personages, like the politics of private loyalties, persists undimmed. It is, I suspect, an experience every field anthropologist has, and certainly one I have had so repeatedly, that I have come to think it emblematic of the whole operation, to come upon individuals in the course of research who seem to have been waiting there at some unlikely place for someone like you, bright-eyed, ignorant, obliging, credulous, to happen along, so as to have the chance not just to answer your questions, but to instruct you as to which ones to ask. People with a story to tell, a view to unfold, an image to impart, a theory to argue, concerning what it is that they, their town or their village, their country, their religion, their kinship system, their language, their past, their way of growing rice or bargaining or weaving, their music, their sex, their politics, their inner lives, quote, really, genuinely, truly, in fact are. Sampayang kula ngomongi, the Javanese say. You I talk at. The verb is causative, not suasive. It's an impacting force. Shuf and kulak. Attend, I say to you, the Moroccans. The mood is imperative, almost Quranic. Anthropologists react diversely to such persons, and the same anthropologist reacts diversely to them at diverse times. Sometimes they seem lapel grabbers essential to escape from, so we can see things, as we like to say, for ourselves. Sometimes they seem like natural deposits of raw expertise, luckily stumbled upon. But whatever one's reactions, and however vacillating, it occurs at length, or anyway it has occurred to me after the fact, in that double pun mean I've been so shamelessly exploiting here, that the you I talk at, attend I say to you, a stance is one's own. I too have stories to tell, views to unfold, images to impart, theories to argue, and I'm eager to expose them to whomever I might get to sit still and listen. Describing cultures, or as I have here selected bits of them purposefully arranged and cut to fit, is not to set out some odd sort of object, a knot in hyperspace. It is to try to induce somebody somewhere, say California, to look at some things as I have been induced by journeys, books, witnesses, and conversations to look at them, to take an interest. This notion that to describe a form of life is to show it forth in a certain light, nicely adjusted, seems harmless enough, even banal. But it has some difficult implications, of which perhaps the most difficult is that the light, such as it is, and the adjustment as well, comes from the description, not from what the description describes: Islam, gender, speech style, rank. Things are, doubtless, whatever they are. What else could they be? But it is in accounts of them that we traffic. Our informants, our colleagues, our forerunners, our own. And they are constructs, stories about stories, views about views. Just why it is this idea that cultural description is fashion knowledge secondhand so bothers some people is not entirely clear to me. Perhaps it has something to do with the necessity, if one adopts it, to take personal responsibility for the cogency of what one says or writes, because one has, after all, said or written it, rather than displacing that responsibility onto, quote, reality, nature, the world, or some other vague and capacious reservoir of incontaminate truth. Perhaps it is a result of a fear that to acknowledge that one has put something together, rather than found it glistening on a beach, is to undermine its claim to true being and actuality. But a chair is culturally, historically, socially constructed, a product of acting persons informed by notions not wholly their own. Yet you can sit in it, it can be well made or ill, and it cannot, at least in the present state of the art, be made out of water, or this, for those haunted by, quote, idealism, thought into existence. Or perhaps it is merely that accepting the fact that facts are made, as etymology, factum, factus, facere, in itself ought to alert us, plunges one into the sort of laborious, winding, and nervously self-conscious tracing of how one has come to say what one has come to say, that I have tried to begin, for my own case, here. The flat presentation of bankable findings does indeed seem simpler and more straightforward, comforting, knowledge as it is supposed to look. The only trouble is that it is itself a bit of a romance, and not altogether the most artless one. Two disrupted towns, two half-ordered countries, two conglomerate forms of life, and a recurrent anthropologist building collapsible airships do not make for sharp conclusions. What they make for, or so I hope, is an instructive example of the heuristic uses of belatedly appreciated commotion and muddle, the value there is in coming too late and leaving too early, from drifting along like an earnest excursionist behind the partial sightings of receding experience. Thank you very much. Ryan, great to see you. How are you? I'll talk to you in a minute. I have to talk to them first. First, I have to seize people. Are there any more questions? Are there any questions? All been thoroughly persuaded? All right, thank you very much. I've enjoyed being here.